They buried him at dawn, just beyond the fence line, under the tallest sycamore in the canyon. The grave was shallow not from neglect, but because the ground was stubborn that spring, hardened by frost that wouldn't yield. Clara knelt as the sun lifted above the ridges, her gloved fingers brushing the edges of the cross she'd carved from fencewood. No preacher, no hymn, just wind, dirt, and a woman who refused to cry because tears were a luxury she couldn't afford. Her husband, Will Hargrove, had been many things: rail scout, lumber hauler, and lately, a man digging at rocks like they could bleed answers. He'd spent his final year convinced gold lived in the side of Larkspur Ridge. No one believed him. They said grief from losing their only son had bent his mind, but Clara knew better. Will didn't chase dreams. He chased proof, and now he was gone, and the ridge still stood mute, dusty, hiding whatever truth he died for. The townsfolk trickled back to their wagons after the burial. No one lingered. No one offered much more than a nod. Clara wasn't surprised. Redemption Ridge hadn't known kindness since the old wars. The mines dried, the land cracked, and men became quiet. They didn't offer comfort unless it bought them something. And a widow with no children and no fortune had nothing worth trading. Back in her cabin, she lit the stove with trembling hands. The floor still creaked where her son had spilled molasses 2 winters ago. His boots still sat by the door, dusty but waiting. Will's coat still hung on the back chair. The silence was not peaceful, it was the echo of a family undone. That evening, Clara walked the same path her husband used to take toward the edge of Larkspur Ridge. She didn't bring tools, only a lantern and her husband's journal, bound in cracked leather and smelling of coal smoke. He'd left it on their bedside the night before the fever took him. Every page was filled with notes, drawings, coordinates, even poetry scratched between survey lines. Near the back was a sketch of a ridge wall, marked with an X that Will had circled twice. Clara sat there long after the lantern burned out. She didn't know what she was waiting for: a sign, maybe, a reason to keep breathing. The stars came out, spilling light across the valley like dust from heaven. The ridge loomed in the distance, quiet, but something had changed in her. They buried her husband that morning. By nightfall, Clara Hargrove had begun something else. Something no one could see yet, not even her. Redemption wasn't in a sermon or a signature. It was in the soil, and Clara had just picked up the shovel. The following morning brought no comfort, only wind. It howled through the canyons like a wounded animal, carrying the sharp scent of sage and the sorrow of everything Clara had buried. She stepped into Will's old boots, the ones too big for her, worn smooth at the heels, cracked at the seams. She wrapped his scarf twice around her neck and tucked his journal beneath her arm. Larkspur Ridge wasn't far, but the path to it wasn't made for grieving hearts. The land didn't welcome her. It challenged her. Dead branches clawed at her sleeves, stones rolled beneath her feet. Even the sun seemed harsher, like it burned just to remind her that she still breathed. She moved slowly at first, retracing the same path her husband had walked every week after Sunday supper. Back then, she'd watch from the porch, pretending not to worry. Pretending he wasn't chasing something he might never find. But now, she knew. He hadn't been chasing gold. He was chasing closure. Chasing proof that their boy's death had meaning. As she reached the foothills, she opened the journal. The map he'd drawn showed a bend near a cedar stump, then a crevice behind a split boulder. The lines were shaky, water-stained, but the message was clear. He'd found something he hadn't yet had time to bring back. Clara's fingers traced the ink with care. She followed the sketch, matching each ridge and rock. Her breath grew shallow as she crested the slope. Then there it was, a hollow in the ridge face, half covered by fallen timber and sand. Barely enough space to crawl through, but she did. Inside, the air was dry, still, thick with the scent of minerals and thyme. Her lantern flickered against jagged walls that sparkled faintly in the shadows. It wasn't just any cavity, was marked. Scratches along the rock showed someone had been there. And near the back, under a heap of stones, she found it, a leather pouch, heavy. Her hands trembled as she opened it. Inside were gold flakes. Real ones, not fools, dust. She recognized the texture. Will had taught her the difference years ago, during better times, back when they'd shared dreams. Instead of sorrows, he'd done it. He'd found gold. He'd been right. She didn't weep. Not then. She just sat there, in the darkness, holding that little bag like it was her last tether to everything she'd lost. Outside, the wind had calmed. The world had shifted, and she could feel it in her bones. This wasn't just about gold. This was about reclaiming what was taken. About restoring the dignity that had been drained from their name, one hardship at a time. As Clara emerged from the cave, the sun was already dipping westward. Her clothes were dusty, hands bloodied from scraping rock, but her steps were steady. She didn't look back at the cave. She didn't need to. The truth was now inside her. The fire that Will once carried was hers to tend. Back in town, no one knew what she'd found. To them, she was still the widow who stayed behind. The woman with no future, just a quiet cabin and a fading name. But Clara knew better. The ridge had spoken, and redemption had begun its slow, silent crawl back into the light. Clara didn't rush. In a town where gossip rode faster than any horse, silence was her only weapon. She returned from the ridge without fanfare, tucked the pouch beneath the floorboards beside her wedding quilt, and let the days pass like drifting smoke. Every morning, she swept her porch. Every afternoon, she fed the hens and stitched mended socks. But in her chest, something rumbled, something slow and deep, like thunder gathering beneath dry skies. She read Will's journal by candlelight each night, memorizing every detail, every note. The map wasn't just to one cavit, was a pattern. He'd tracked the soil density, the water runoff, even the patterns of dry moss along the ridge. Will had known something greater. He wasn't just chasing luck. He was mapping a vein, something rich enough to change not just their lives but the entire town's. But redemption wasn't ready to be changed. Not yet. People passed Clara without glancing twice. At the general store, she still got the smallest cut of meat. At church, her pew stayed empty. Women whispered behind gloved hands, and men spoke of railroads and cattle runs as though gold had never touched this land. She let them. She wasn't ready either, not for their hands, not for their hunger. She needed time. Time to understand what she held. Time to decide what to do with a truth too big for one widow's heart. One evening, while oiling the hinges of Will's old barn, she saw them, 3 men on horses, just beyond the tree line, watching. She recognized one from the mining office, another from the land claims board. The third was a stranger with a rifle strapped to his back and a sneer carved deep into his face. They didn't approach. Not then. But they knew. Somehow, they knew. Clara didn't sleep that night. She sat by the hearth, sharpening Will's old tools, her fingers steady. The pouch of gold stayed buried, but she felt its weight in every breath. She didn't fear for herself. She feared for the land, for the ridge, for the silence her husband had honored with every strike of his pick. The next morning, she rode into town straight to the deed office. She didn't speak, just handed over a slip of paper, her husband's land claim renewal. It had expired 3 weeks after his death. No one had touched it since, but she had memorized the dates. She had every survey, every journal page, every signature he'd left behind. The clerk looked confused, then irritated, then afraid, but Clara didn't flinch. She signed her name in full, firm letters: Clara Ruth Hargrove, widow, sole heir, legal owner of Larkspur Ridge. As she stepped outside, the sky broke open, not with rain, with dust winds sweeping through the town like it carried a warning. Hats flew, horses reared, but Clara stood still. The town hadn't noticed her in months. Now, all eyes turned. Redemption was coming. And it would not knock twice. Clara's name began to rise in whispers, first in the saloon, then at the mill, then from porch to porch, like a hymn no wanted to admit they remembered. Folks didn't speak of the gold. Not yet. They spoke of the woman who renewed a dead man's claim. The woman who walked alone into the deed office and walked out with the ridge in her name. The same woman who buried both her son and her husband and never asked for pity. That kind of woman made men nervous. The first offer came 3 days later. A banker's envelope tucked beneath her door and signed, but thick with promise. A cash advance, papers ready, a tidy sum in exchange for rights of exploration. She burned it without reading twice. The second offer came with a visit, smiling men with polished boots and sharp eyes who praised Will's vision and Clara's courage. They called her smart, progressive, reasonable. She didn't invite them in. By the third offer, she stopped answering her door altogether. Clara wasn't waiting for validation. She was listening for the land. She returned to the ridge each morning, studying the terrain like scripture. There were patterns in the rock, in the way the wind curled through certain canyons. Will had found more than a pocket of gold. He had found the edge of something deeper, something buried by centuries of silence. The soil whispered things most people didn't care to hear, but Clara heard. One morning, she brought a spade instead of a lantern. She began marking the earth near the second ridge wall, where a dry creek bed split into shale. What she uncovered wasn't a seam but a shaft, braced by rotted beams, buried under years of landslide and silence. It was older than Will's notes, older than the town charter. A forgotten mine, sealed shut by time itself. The markings on the timber were Cheyenne, a warning. Clara froze, her breath caught. Redemption Ridge had never belonged to the town. It had belonged to people long before fences, long before mines. She didn't step forward. She knelt, and for the first time since burying Will, she wept not from grief, but from understanding. The gold wasn't new. It was stolen long ago, and the earth had tried to keep it hidden. But now it stirred, disturbed again. Back in town, the wind carried more than rumors. Men began to circle her property lines. Surveyors appeared without names. Mules were spotted hauling tools through the woods. Someone had started digging again on her land, without permission. The sheriff gave no answers. The mayor gave no help. Clara was alone, and she knew it. But she wasn't powerless. She rode to the edge of the ridge that evening, where the old mine slept beneath a canvas of stars. She tied a strip of her son's blanket to the post Will had placed years ago. A signal, a warning, a memory dot. Then she lit a lantern and placed it by the shaft's mouth. Not to welcome, but to remind them, this ground remembers, and so does she. The lantern burned through the night, casting a soft glow over the shaft's edge like a watchful eye that never blinked. When Clara returned in the morning, it was gone, snuffed, stolen, or simply vanished. In its place, fresh bootprints, larger than any of hers, led back into the tree line. She stood in silence, wind catching her coat, and stared at the opening. The warning had been ignored. Something had been taken from the earth again. But not just gold. That day, a man named Roy Sutter was found beaten behind the supply barn in town. A rival prospector with a reputation for filing false claims and bribing claim jumpers. His mouth was bloodied shut, but his hands clutched a smooth, shimmering nugget of gold, streaked with red clay. The color of Larkspur Ridge. By sunset, the entire town knew exactly where he'd found it. The ridge was no longer Clara's secret. It was a storm now, gathering speed. More men came. Some with claims, others with guns. The law offered no shelter. When Clara returned home that evening, she found her barn door splintered and her pantry emptied. Her garden, once carefully tended, was trampled. Her late son's boots were gone from the porch. The silence had been broken not by violence, but by greed, and it echoed louder than any bullet. Still, she did not run. She sat at the edge of the ridge, above the forgotten shaft, and began to write. Page after page, she recorded everything: Will's maps, her own findings, every trespass she'd seen, every voice she heard in town. She wrote of the Cheyenne markings, of the warnings carved into wood, of the reverence the land once commanded before men tried to claim it like spoils. Then she did something even bolder. She rode out to the edge of the nearby tribal land, bordered the dry grass, plains, and left copies of the journal at 3 sacred stone piles known only to the elders. She left them wrapped in cloth with sprigs of desert thyme, a peace offering. A reckoning. By the time she returned, riders were already camped at the base of her hill, tents forming like spores in dry wind, miners, drifters, even boys too young to shave, holding pickaxes like they were keys to a kingdom. Clara sat inside her cabin and listened. To the coughing, to the gambling, to the songs slurred under moonlight. The ridge was under siege. But she no longer mourned. Because something in the earth had awakened, and the people who thought it belonged to them would soon remember it. DIDN, single quotes T. 2 nights later. A heavy thunder rolled across the ridge, not from sky, but from ground. A sink in the old shaft collapsed with a growl loud enough to wake the camps. Tents fell, men scattered. The land had answered, not with riches, but warning. And from her porch, Clara watched with eyes dry as bone. She didn't cheer. She didn't cry. She simply whispered. Without a voice, this isn't yours. This is redemption's, and it always was. The ridge no longer sang, it roared. In the weeks that followed, the cave-in redemption found itself divided not by fences, but by fear. The ground shook again days later. Not violently, just enough to rattle nerves and knock over lamps. Just enough to remind the men camped on claim that the earth was not a thing to be taken, but a thing to be answered. Half the tents vanished by morning. Wagons rolled out quietly under cover of dawn. Miners who once spat on Clara's name now lowered their eyes when she passed. But others, fewer, greedier, held their ground. They whispered of reinforcements, of machines from the east, of drills, and steam carts and contracts forged in smoke-filled parlors. Clara heard every word, but she didn't waver. One afternoon, a messenger boy rode hard into town. He carried nothing but a letter marked with a tribal seal to Cheyenne. Word had reached them. Word of trespass. Of echoes. Of stolen silence. The letter didn't threaten. It reminded Larkspur Ridge, long before maps, had belonged to the spirits of the canyon. And blood, once spilled, calls back memory. That same day Clara climbed to the ridge once more. This time, she didn't carry tools or journals. She carried the last possession that mattered, her son's blanket, torn and threadbare from years of grief. She laid it over the mouth of the collapsed shaft like a veil, and sat beside it as evening came. The wind stilled. Even the birds kept low. The air held its breath, then dashed footsteps, not of miners, not of men. Clara turned and saw them. Riders. Silent, proud, and cloaked in the colors of the land. Cheyenne elders, flanked by younger warriors, rode in from the far side of the ridge. They made no speeches. They made no claims. They simply stood with her, shoulder to shoulder, facing the mountain as if waiting for it to speak again. By morning, they built a ring of stones around the shaft. Not a barrier. A memorial, a vow. That week, redemption changed. The mining office shuttered. The banker who sent the first offer left without notice. The sheriff resigned quietly. And the mayor, once eager to sell parcels of Clara's land to outside investors, disappeared from public view altogether. Clara never sought praise, but one by one, the townsfolk came. Women brought bread. Men repaired her fences. Children planted flowers along the grave beneath the sycamore tree. No words were spoken. They were not needed. The ridge had given its answer. Months passed. Spring returned. Grass pushed through scorched earth. Wildflowers bloomed near the ring of stones. No one touched the ridge again. It stood sacred, silent, scarred but whole, and Clara. She stayed. Not as a guardian of gold, but as a steward of memory, of silence, of the truth her husband died to reveal. Her cabin remained humble. Her hands stayed calloused. But every Sunday, she sat beneath the sycamore with a tin mug of coffee and watched the light fall across the ridge. People stopped calling it Hargrove's land. They called it something older, something earned. They called it frontier redemption. And in the quiet, between wind gusts, you could still hear the ridge breathe alive, and finally, at peace.